Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for my class for Tuesday the 14th, where we are talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I've been working my way through paper number 1, so if you haven't received it back yet, you should shortly. And I'm just going in the order of receipt for the papers. And it's time to talk about paper number 2, believe it or not. So if you were to look in the syllabus and other documents folder, you will see that I have posted selections for possible topics for paper number 2, which is going to be very similar to paper number 1. The difference, of course, is that you would be writing about drama rather than writing about short story. So once again, you have the option of writing about canon, selecting a drama in the drama section, whether it be Oedipus or Midsummer or Raisin, that you think should be included in the literary canon, giving reasons why, or perhaps selecting a drama that you think should not be included in the literary canon and giving your reasons why. Or you could talk about contemporary relevance. So you could talk about how one of the plays, again, either Oedipus, Midsummer, or Raisin in the Sun, does have contemporary relevance or does not have contemporary relevance. Again, the focus being on the play itself, not necessarily on contemporary times, though you do need to reference contemporary times. And of course, regardless of the topic you choose, you want to use examples and details, paraphrase and quotation from the text. And you can also create your own essay topic. You just want to make sure that you have your topic approved by me. As you know, you all have the option of rewriting paper number 1. So after I've returned it to you, you'll see that it's got a good number of comments on it. And if you incorporate those comments into a revision, and if you need further direction, please let me know. Then ultimately, I ask that you submit in the original copy that you submitted with my comments on it so I can compare and contrast with your revision. You would have the higher of the 2 grades. And you have up until the ending of the semester in which to do that. So that said, the second paper will be due at the ending of the semester, so it doesn't seem like you would have time to rewrite it. But I see the first paper as a learning exercise, second paper just incorporating what you learned from the first paper. Not that you're required to do a revision. If you're happy with your grade, then you can just leave it at that. But in terms of thinking about which drama to write about, it may be about Oedipus, it may be about Midsummer, as we're putting some closure onto it. But if you are still not certain, it might be Raisin in the Sun. So I'm hopeful at this point that you have completed reading A Midsummer Night's Dream. And what you are doing is that you are in the midst of reading A Raisin in the Sun. If you haven't already finished reading A Raisin in the Sun, the good news is after Raisin in the Sun, we're done with our drama unit, and we are beginning with poetry. And there's good and bad news about poetry. Poetry is much shorter than drama, so this will move much faster. But poetry is highly condensed. In theory, a 3-line poem could result in a 4 or 5-page 5-page paper. So every word in a poem, even every piece of punctuation in a poem, can have significance. So you need to reread, and even more so than what you would do with other pieces of literature. But we'll get to that point. Because we're ending the semester with poetry, there won't be time for you to submit in a poetry paper. However, what we will have is a final exam on the last day of class, and that final examination will be basically mostly devoted to poetry, 80 points. What I'm just going to do is select some of the poems that we've discussed in class and ask you to expand and elaborate on those poems. And you'll have choice within that. So that'll be 80 points of the final. And then that leaves 10 points for short story and 10 points for drama. And the best way to prepare for the final is basically to have done all the readings and watched all the class videos and read all of the class discussion forum posts. As you can see, I've fallen a little bit behind with the discussion forums as well as with the grading, but I will be catching up shortly. so that you can utilize that information for your upcoming assignments. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. This could be quite helpful to you for determining something like a paper topic, for instance, if you wanted to pursue your own paper topic. And with Midsummer Night's Dream, as we've done with all three dramas, we began with talking about performance. We saw a performance by Hoffman that was done in 1999 of a budget of $11 million. Its earnings at the box office were $16.1 million. So basically, it earned a nice amount of profit, which is no small feat for Shakespeare and contemporary times. And I think I shared with you that I initially saw this movie in the theater, and there was a wide range of audience members there for a whole host of reasons. I think they were quite clever with using A-list actors and trying to simplify some of the language and shorten some of the plot. And certainly the visuals are majestic with location filming. It was filmed in Italy, and you can see that lush green landscape that reinforces thematically what comedies are about, the idea of renewal and regeneration. Film dates from March of 1998 to May of 1998. And some of the themes that I wanted to reinforce with you, that we've talked about them somewhat, is that love makes everyone, regardless of age, regardless of station, regardless of status, regardless of stage of relationship, an idiot. At least Shakespeare's equal opportunity, so all of us are included underneath that umbrella. That love can destroy friendships, as we saw so clearly with Helena and Hermia, who were former best friends, who become best enemies, in effect, by the third act, because they're fighting over, basically, love relationships. Love is like a spell, which is one of the reasons why magic and spellcraft is part of the play, is that we are influenced and manipulated. We no longer have free will. It's as if we were bewitched, so to speak, when we're in love. We aren't able to see clearly. And love is like a dream. And that means that there are also parallels with sleep. And think about some of the language we use with sleep. We fall asleep, we fall in love. There are both negative associations with the idea of falling, both the sense that one could get hurt or at the very least embarrassed, but also one could be killed. It's something that you want to try to avoid. And it certainly is something that you can't control. It's accidental when you fall. So think about all of the ways that love is like a dream. Dreams aren't real. Perhaps love isn't real. Dreams come to an end. Perhaps love comes to an end. A dream can turn into a nightmare. Perhaps love can turn into a nightmare. But despite all of these negative comments about love, we have a comedy, so we know that things have to lighten up. Some social commentary in here as well, that beauty need not be tall and blonde, which was the expectation of the time. So someone like Helena should have had all of the male attention at the beginning of the play, being both tall and blonde. And instead, it's the short brunette Hermia. This is a theme we will see in Shakespeare's sonnets as well. And not that we read many sonnets in this introductory class, or even in my Shakespeare class, we read about a dozen, or even less than that, half a dozen sonnets. He wrote over 100. But even in that half a dozen, we get to see some commentary about beauty. And there is reference to someone known as a dark lady, someone with dark hair and dark eyes, not necessarily dark skin, that at the very least Shakespeare was infatuated with. The very most he was having an active affair with, and he praises her beauty in many, many sonnets. Females can defy powerful male figures, and we see that within the play, but it's complicated. It's not as clear-cut as all females always being able to successfully defy male figures. I like the complexity because real life is complicated, and I think that Shakespeare's plays reinforce some of the messages in real life, is that you can't necessarily always predict. Things aren't black or white. There's shades of gray. But we have strong female characters like a Hermia who dares to defy her father. And for a woman and a daughter to defy the most powerful male figure in their life. This is some pretty powerful stuff, and she successfully does it by the ending of the play. That said, there are more complicated women. You have somebody like Fairy Titania. Yes, she defies her husband. She doesn't want to give him the changeling boy. In fact, she's denying him sexual relations as a way to have a power struggle with him. But at the ending of the play, she loses the changeling boy, and she's been humiliated by Fairy Oberon. And she's willing to accept him back at the ending of the play and able to forgive. And that might be a lot of suspension of disbelief from our parts. But again, a happy ending in a comedy meant marriage or the promise of marriage. So that's the resolution. You have somebody like a Queen Hippolyta, who was the queen of the Amazons, a strong warrior woman, yet she was defeated in war and conquered by King Theseus. Not an unusual way for a relationship to go about. That relationship was a political or a social union. But the assumption is that despite their rocky start, it seems that by the ending of the play, they're quite content with one another. Affection was thought to develop after marriage, not necessarily before marriage. So quite the opposite from contemporary times. And perhaps the most complicated female of all, Helena. That certainly by contemporary standards, she seems quite weak, quite passive, quite submissive as she continues to chase Demetrius, even though he has no interest in her. However, she does at one point says women were not made to woo. And she takes on the role of the wooer and the pursuer, even though that would be against the expectations of the time. And lo and behold, Helena gets her way by the ending of the play. And of course, we can wonder whether or not this is a completely happy ending, because Demetrius has been manipulated by love juice to love Helena by the end. But remember that prior to the play, Demetrius had loved Helena. So at least during the time of the Renaissance, this would be seen as a kind of restoration of order, in effect. And of course, the young lovers all forgive one another, even those terrible things were said and done. In Act 3, you talked about the pyramid structure of Shakespeare, and that at the bottom left-hand side of the pyramid would be Act 1, where we're introduced to characters. That's exactly what we see. And then in Act 2, we begin to see the rising of conflict, which is exactly what we see. And then at the top of the pyramid, the tip would be Act 3, and that's the height of conflict, which is exactly what we see. If this was a tragedy, these lovers would actually not only come to blows, but kill one another. But it is a comedy, so we need to have a happy resolution. And then on the right side of the pyramid, towards the descent, we've got Act 4, the beginning resolution, and Act 5, resolution. Though Midsummer's a little bit different. It seems as if the play is done in Act 4. It could have been. And then Act 5, we have the play within a play. But that's not just tacked on Act 5. It's very important understanding the play as a whole. Nothing is accidental with Shakespeare. And that said, another theme in Shakespeare's play is the fact that virginity is all important for female. She would be seen as damaged goods if she wasn't a virgin. This is why we get hints or clues throughout the play that the young female lovers, the women, are virginal. Yet, the play is set in midsummer. It's a pagan day that's associated with sexual union. There's reference to May Day, another pagan holiday that's associated with sexual union. It's set at nighttime, again, a time where oftentimes there's sexual union. So there is that undertone of the play about talking about sex with a wink and a nod, right down to Bottom being turned into a donkey or an ass, because it would have been known during the time of the Renaissance, or it would have been believed, that the ass was the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. And it's pretty obvious that Bottom the ass and Fairy Queen Titania consummate their relationship. And it becomes even more complex when you think about the fact that you've got a human, which is Bottom, with a fairy, Titania. Or even on another level, the fairy Titania is in human form. The human Bottom is in animal form. So now we've got an animal paired with a human. So lots of layers to Shakespeare's play to appeal to lots of different audience members, which would have been necessary because this really was the television of the time. So everybody in society would come to see the plays. So you wanted to make sure that there were possible interpretations for any level of society member. The writing, that in and of itself is the reason why we talk about the greatness of Shakespeare, that he's able to use poetry in order to forward plot. Not an easy thing. We saw the attempt with that with Oedipus, but of course we were reading a translation, so we'll never get the true sense. Using things like rhyme, the ending sounds of words that are similar, or alliteration, the beginning sounds of words that are similar. Using symbolism and imagery and metaphor, using meter or beat. And for Shakespeare, it's stressed and unstressed. Ba-pum, 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 ba-pum. And it mimics a heartbeat, very deliberately so. And it's been theorized that's one of the reasons why Shakespeare's language is so appealing to the ear, because it mimics the first sound that we all would have heard, which is our mother's heartbeat when we were in the womb. And he would oftentimes write in not just meter, but something called iambic pentameter, a 10-syllable line. So you've got shall, I, compare, thee, to, a, some, mers, day. It's 10 syllables. That's no mistake. And we'll talk about that when we get to the sonnets. So there's a level of complexity here, especially because poetry was thought to have been spoken by the higher orders, those individuals who had advanced education or station in life. And then prose or complete sentences would be spoken by the lower orders, those who had less education or less refinement. And Shakespeare would mix that up. And while Shakespeare could be pretty open talking about sex and violence, he had to be quite cautious talking about politics. It could get him killed. And that said, it's not that he didn't question the social and political structures of the time. He just did it in a much more covert way, in a much more subtle way. One of the ways he did it was through language, where you could have a higher level character who's supposed to be speaking in poetry, all of a sudden speaking in prose, complete sentences, to show their descent. Or you could have a lower level character who should be speaking in prose, complete sentences, begins to speak in poetry to show his ascent. But I wanted to talk a little bit about quotation, and there are many, many quotes in the play that we could examine. And we could easily spend an entire semester just talking about Midsummer. That's been true of all of the texts we've read, but especially when it comes to Shakespeare. But I just wanted to illustrate a few quotes from each of the acts that I thought were interesting. And note, if you will, that when we refer to Shakespeare quotation, we do not need to rely on page number the way we usually do with quotes, because Shakespeare's plays, and during Shakespeare's time, this was a convention, the plays were divided into act, into scene, and into line, which universalizes them. So it doesn't matter which edition you're using. It doesn't matter if it's online or if it's in print. Ultimately, we don't need to rely on the page number. Instead, I can say Act 1, Scene 1, line 93, and everybody can get to that point. And if you look in the notes below under quotes, you'll see the way that we would indicate that in parentheses. We use a capital Roman numeral for the act. So that would be for the first quotation, Act 1. And then we use a lowercase Roman numeral for the scene. And in this instance, it's a lowercase 1, so this means Act 1, Scene 1. Notice we use periods to separate act, scene, and then ultimately line. And then we use Arabic numerals, let's say a 93-94, to indicate the lines, 93 through 94. So that's what you would put in the parentheses immediately following the quote, rather than the page number. This is something that you can't do with Oedipus, because Oedipus is a translation. So the line numbers would always be different based on the translation that you are reading. And you can't do a Raisin in the Sun because it's not divided into act, scene, and line. But you can do it with Shakespeare, and you're expected to do it that way, which is why I've referenced all of the quotes below this video by act, scene, and line. So wit. Shakespeare's known for his wit. Just a very subtle example of this very early on in the play. Act 1, Scene 1, line 93. Lysander is speaking to Demetrius and tells Demetrius, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermias." Yeah, it seems, that's a little dig there. Now, we know that with dramas, we need to be given history in a way that probably is a little bit more problematic than when we're reading a short story, because a short story can just sort of tell us about past events. But in a drama, it needs to be incorporated into dialogue. So, one of the pieces of dialogue in Act 1, Scene 1, line 107 is Lysander speaking. And Lysander says, Demetrius made love to Neater's daughter, Helena. I want to be clear, when he said made love to Helena, he's not talking about sexual relations. He's talking about wooing her. Again, it'd be very important that she be a virgin so that she wouldn't be viewed as damaged goods at the time in order for us to have our happy ending. Morals are oftentimes embedded in Shakespeare's plays, and very early on, Lysander gives one of the major morals of the play. Act 1, Scene 1, line 134. The course of true love never did run smooth. Very famous Shakespearean quote that you might have heard in other contexts. One of the things Shakespeare likes to do is oftentimes contrast good rhyme and good writing with bad rhyme and bad writing. The idea being that Shakespeare produces the good stuff and his competition produces the bad stuff. And we see this very early on in the play, the very simple piece of dialogue. This is in Act 1, Scene 1, line 202. Hermia is speaking at this point and talking about her plans. And again, poetry is being used in order to forward plot. But notice how naturally this is combined, the verse as well as the forwarding of the plot. Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then what graces in my love do dwell, that he hath turned a heaven unto a hell. Notice the rhyme. And then shortly thereafter, we have Bottom illustrating bad rhyme. We know Bottom mangles language, so that's not too surprising. He, of course, is rehearsing for the play Pyramus and Thisbe. And this happens to be in Act 1, Scene 2, line 31 to 38. And he says, the raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far and make and mar the foolish fates. Even worse, he says after that, that was lofty. In other words, he's complimenting himself on doing a good job. So not only is that arrogant, but this poetry is nonsense. Yes, it rhymes, but it would be very similar to saying something like roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. That poem rhymes too, but it doesn't necessarily have depth or complexity or any kind of interest to it. So Bottom's poetry is just nonsense. We'll see much more of this in Act 5. But first I want to go to Act 2. Talking about power dynamics, it's one of the messages that Shakespeare has, that in love relationships, partners are always vying for power. We see this with Titania, when she says in Act 2, Scene 1, line 63, that she has forsworn her husband's bed and company. In other words, she's denying Fairy Oberon sexual relations because they are arguing about the changeling. Sometimes characters will say odd things or seemingly odd things. It's not to forward plot. It's for us as audience to understand what's happening. An example of this is Act 2, Scene 1, line 186, when Oberon says, seemingly out of nowhere, I'm invisible. And this is for us as audience to know that his character has now become invisible. So when the other characters enter the stage or enter onto the stage, they act as if they can't see him. Obviously, he's there, but this is our cue that we should use our imaginations to pretend that he's invisible, because we don't have modern day special effects to make him be invisible. Threats. And one of the things that Demetrius says to Helena in Act 2, Scene 1, line 236, is very early on in the play. This is when Helena's pursuing him in the wilderness, and he says, if thou follow me, I shall do thee mischief in the wood. In other words, he's threatening to take her virginity if she continues to pursue him. Get another piece of evidence that she's virginal, because if she wasn't, again, this would not be a comedy. Lots of references to gender. One of them I've referenced earlier when Helena says in Act 2, Scene 1, line 240, your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be wooed. We're not made to woo. So she's talking about the idea that men should be the active pursuer, not women. And then To give, again, another reference to virginity and modesty, Hermia. This is when she's in the woods with Lysander, and there is temptation. They're alone after all. It's dark after all. Lysander wants to lie next to her at night, and she says in Act 2, Scene 2, line 57, "For love and courtesy lie further off, inhumane modesty." In other words, that she wants to remain virginal until after marriage. So Act 3, which would be the height, the pinnacle of the pyramid, this is where we're going to get the height of tension, and we're also going to get some morals. One coming from Bottom, rather ironic because he's such an idiot. Yet Bottom is not involved in a love relationship in the beginning of the play, unlike the film adaptation that we saw. I wish they hadn't given him a wife. Certainly, Bottom becomes involved in a love relationship once Titania falls in love with him and he just goes with it. But perhaps because he's not always involved in a love relationship, he's able to have a bit of insight that the other characters don't have. When he says in Act 3, Scene 2, line 143, "Reason and love keep little company nowadays." One of the morals is that love interferes with the ability to reason. Another moral by Puck, and notice Puck is involved in no love relationship at any point in the play. Perhaps this allows him the greatest ability to retain reason and rationality. "What fools these mortals be." Act 3, Scene 2, line 115. And, of course, I would argue it's not just the mortals. It also happens to be the fairies, as we see with Fairy Oberon and Fairy Titania. The insults fly fast and furious in this play, where former best friends become best enemies. And one of the insults, which is delivered by Helena to her former best friend Hermia, she calls Hermia, "You puppet." Act 3, Scene 2, line 288. And a puppet is small. There's going to be a lot of insults about Hermia's height because she's short and brunette. Puppet is also controlled or manipulated by someone else. A worse insult comes from Hermia to Helena, calling Helena, "You painted maypole." Act 3, Scene 2, line 296. And a maypole is a phallic symbol for May Day. And so she basically has called her best friend a penis because her friend is tall and thin. So she resembles a phallus. And painted, meaning makeup. In other words, a false face, a harlot, a strumpet, a whore, in effect. So this is a pretty significant insult. And how quickly love turns to hate when you've got insults like, "Away, you Ethiop." Ethiop in reference to Ethiopia, again in reference to Hermia's features, not necessarily her skin, but her dark hair and dark eyes. Act 3, Scene 2, or line 250 and line 258. Or even worse, Lysander continues and says, "Should I hurt her, strike her, kill her dead?" This is line 268. So this is his first go-to, that he's decided that not only does he no longer love her, illustrating how fickle love is, but, well, maybe I should hurt her or kill her. I guess not. And then Lysander's insults continue in Act 3, Scene 2, line 327. "Get you gone, you dwarf. You minimus. You bead. You acorn." And again, all insults based on height. So, or lack of height. In Act 4, which is where we get seemingly the resolution for this play. At this point, we know that Puck needs to intervene and we need to have some sort of resolution. So the love juice is going to be removed from Lysander's eyes. So Lysander goes back to loving Hermia, and we might have to suspend some disbelief here, is willing to forgive Lysander, and seemingly they will live happily ever after. The love juice remains on Demetrius's eyes. And again, perhaps we have to suspend some disbelief here that this is a happy ending because he basically is loving against his will, albeit prior to the play, he had loved Helena. So at the time of the Renaissance, this would be seen as a restoration of order. And of course, Helena is willing to forgive and forget. Again, that might also be a bit of a stretch for our imagination. But that means that all four lovers are happy with one another. So we need to go back to King Theseus, who at the beginning of the play needed to make a ruling. At this point, he realizes this is probably the best of all possible worlds, that he's got all four lovers content. So he's going to allow the lovers to remain in their unions, and he's going to overrule Aegeus, the father, who is upset. Any other decision Theseus would make more people angry. So I think this is a smart political move. Though interesting commentary from Shakespeare, especially during this time period, that a daughter can defy her father and be successful at it. And then Bottom comes up with another moral. Act 4, Scene 1, line 206. Man is but an ass. And of course, there's great humor in this because Bottom acts like an ass and was literally turned into an ass. But of course, that's one of the messages in the play, that we all turn into asses when we are in love. So there's a lot to be upset about if you're an audience member. You might have been offended over a number of things. So this is time for Shakespeare to do a little bit of cleanup, a little bit of apology if necessary, and a little bit of flattery. And in Act 4, there's a seemingly very innocent dialogue between King Theseus and Queen Hippolyta. They're getting ready to watch the Pyramus and Thisbe play, and they're talking about how the play has been examined as not being, or they've been told that the play is not very good. And they talk about how sometimes that they have to tolerate greetings from their subjects that aren't very good either. And that this is how Theseus responds to that. Where I have come, this is Act 4, Scene 1, line 93. Where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes. Shiver and look pale, in conclusion dumbly broken off. Yet I picked a welcome. So what he's saying is that he knows that sometimes he's not given appropriate greetings and worship, not because someone is being rude, but because someone is so nervous and so overcome by his greatness. And he sees that as flattery, and he takes it in that vein. And the idea is that Queen Elizabeth would have been there watching this play. She certainly has a lot to be upset about. Not only does Shakespeare make general commentary about all of us being asses in love, he made commentary about the royalty being asses in love, both human and fairy. So it wouldn't be a bad idea for Queen Elizabeth to hear this, and the hope being that she sees parallels with herself, that she hears Theseus saying that he ultimately is showing grace, and she would think of herself and say, I'm that kind of ruler. I show grace as well to my subjects when they don't offer me proper greetings, because I know it's not a sign of disrespect, it's just a sign of nervousness. So again, smoothing things over with the queen, not a bad idea. And chances are, of course, if you are royalty and you see something positive about royalty, you're going to connect that with yourself. That's very human. And then in Act 5, which seems to be superfluous, but nothing is superfluous in Shakespeare. So we've got the Pyramus and Thisbe play, which happens to be a play about love. And we just saw a play about love. So this is going to be a mirror. Except this play ends tragically, and Midsummer Night's Dream doesn't. In fact, it should remind you of Romeo and Juliet. And scholars have dated Romeo and Juliet around the same time as A Midsummer Night's Dream, even though we think that most of the comedies were written towards the early part of Shakespeare's career, and most of the tragedies, which is what Romeo and Juliet is, towards the later part of Shakespeare's career. That said, it wasn't as if he wrote all of his plays based on genre, so all of the comedies were written all early. And I think that this is quite clever from Shakespeare to offer us a play, Pyramus and Thisbe, that's similar to Romeo and Juliet. Because if Romeo and Juliet had come out before Midsummer, and keep in mind we're not exactly sure when these plays came out, well then chances are you saw Romeo and Juliet, and then you could see how absurd and badly written and badly acted Pyramus and Thisbe is. In other words, this is Shakespeare saying, this is what my competition does. You saw something great with the first 4 acts of Midsummer, and if it turns out Romeo and Juliet had been viewed prior to this performance of Midsummer, you saw something great in Romeo and Juliet. It's not what you're seeing with Pyramus and Thisbe. Or what a good, let's say, preview for a new play coming out called Romeo and Juliet, that what you just saw was something absurd, Pyramus and Thisbe. You know it's absurd. But you know that the next play that's coming out, which you've heard has a similar kind of plot to Pyramus and Thisbe, this Romeo and Juliet thing, is going to be fantastic, and you can't wait to go see it. The idea, too, that you've got bad acting and bad playwriting in Pyramus and Thisbe is just another way for Shakespeare to show us what his competition is doing. Bad acting, bad playwriting, where everything is taken so literally. Note also that all of the human lovers are watching this play unfold for entertainment, and they're laughing and enjoying themselves. At one point, Hippolyta says, "This is the silliest stuff I ever heard." Act 5, Scene 1, line 210. She's greatly amused. Never once do any of these lovers stop to consider that they themselves had been equally silly just hours earlier. In other words, they have no insight into their own weaknesses and follies. So they've learned nothing, in effect. But the true message is for us as audience. If we are watching A Midsummer Night's Dream and we're thinking this is all so silly, and we never once stopped to consider that we ourselves had act silly when it came to love relationships, then we've learned nothing. That's basically Shakespeare saying that all of us need to engage in some self-reflection. And if we can honestly engage in self-reflection and say, you've never been silly in love, I suspect Shakespeare's response is, well, just give it time. You're just not old enough yet. Eventually, you will be silly in love. Shakespeare's not above putting in a sex joke. I remember the first time that I heard this for Act 5, Scene 1, line 190. It seemed to be quite an innocent statement until my professor explained it. So I don't take credit, nor do I take blame for this. And it's when Pyramus and Thisbe are speaking to one another. Thisbe is speaking to the wall and says, "My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee." Act 5, Scene 1, line 190. Seems innocent enough. But my cherry lips have often kissed thy stones being a symbol for testicles. Thy stones with lime and hair for pubic hair. So in other words, this line is a reference to oral sex. And then finally having an end apology. Very smart from Shakespeare's perspective, because by this point probably everybody is offended. The apology comes from Puck. Seemingly that makes sense since Puck is controlling and manipulating things. I always think that's an interesting commentary in the play. Who actually is in power? Is it Oberon, the fairy king, or is it Puck, who basically is supposed to be the servant who's just acting on orders? Reminds me of modern day parallels in corporations, for instance. Who's really in power? Is it the CEO? And when the CEO is absent, business continues as normal usually. Or is it the administrative assistant, who is not supposed to be the one in power, but when the administrative assistant isn't there, things oftentimes come to a halt. So as much as things change, they remain the same. But nevertheless, Puck has oftentimes been compared to Shakespeare himself, controlling and manipulating the action. And perhaps in Shakespeare's most famous speech, Act 5, Scene 1, line 423. If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended. And notice how he uses the word shadows, because actors are like shadows. They basically are reflections of us, perhaps even darker reflections of us where we can see truths. There isn't any way to avoid a shadow. And shadows are basically mimicking real life, which is what actors do and what these characters are supposed to do in the play. If we shadows have offended, and I guess the question might be, is there anybody here who's not offended? Think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, and that this was a dream. And again, that reinforces the idea of the focus on dreams in the title. But again, dreams aren't real. Again, what we saw was just fictional, so don't take it too seriously. And it talks also a little bit about the idea that if I am an honest Puck, we'll make amends ere long. The thing is, Puck's not honest. So when he gives us this apology, if we shadows have offended, and then he says, if I am an honest Puck, you have to wonder, is this a real apology? Or is it one of those pseudo apologies when you tell somebody that you're sorry, they're feeling badly? That's not really an apology after all. So even at the very end, you've got Shakespeare with this wink and his nod, upsetting what seems to be quite obvious. And Puck also makes references to if we've escaped the serpent's tongue. This is where it's very useful to have a Shakespearean play where you've got good footnotes. Notice that you were given a footnote in your edition that serpent's tongue means hissing. And if you've ever heard the term of booing and hissing, that he's asking the audiences not to do that. And keep in mind that editors who are defining Renaissance language are giving their best guesses as to what language the average reader might need to find. So sometimes they are very accurate and sometimes they're not in their guesses. So sometimes you'll see words defined in footnotes and think, why did they define that? It was obvious. And then sometimes you'll see words that aren't defined and you'll wonder, why didn't they define that? It's just so unclear. So, but nevertheless, the serpent's tongue is hissing, and that was defined for you in the textbook if you are reading Bedford Introduction to Literature. And also Puck asks, give me your hands, which means applause. So when he says, good night unto you all, give me your hands if we be friends, and Robin shall restore amends. So not only is he saying it's over by saying good night, give me your hands, so it's almost like an applause sign. Please applaud for us. And also, he will make amends. Again, if he's offended, he will do his best to offer an apology and to rectify any hurt feelings. But of course, since he's not an honest Puck, I don't even know if we can trust this. Pretty typical Shakespeare of sort of upsetting expectations. And that said, that gives you a little bit of a taste of Midsummer Night's Dream. The problem, I think, with Shakespeare is that people aren't familiar with the language, so they have difficulty following plot. You need to have the plot in order to be able to appreciate the language. But plot is the least of it. And to illustrate this, I talk about a comedic routine that was done with the Three Little Pigs. And you can see that in our notes below as well, where basically the plot is pretty straightforward. I think most people know the children's fairy tale, The Three Little Pigs, where you've got three pigs, one with the house of straw, and one with the house of sticks, and one with the house of bricks. A wolf is trying to blow them down, blows down successfully the first two houses of straw and sticks, but is unable to blow down the house of bricks. Now, I encourage you to watch this comedic routine that is under 10 minutes long. I think it's about 7 minutes or so. And you will see a wonderful retelling of the Three Little Pigs with Renaissance language. It's quite clever. And there is a twist at the end as well, so with some humor. Just to illustrate the point that once you know the story, then you can really appreciate the language. So I hope at this point you're feeling comfortable with, if nothing else, the story of A Midsummer, as well as some of the themes. But as you know, we will be moving forward, and we're moving forward to A Raisin in the Sun, which was not included in our textbook. I had ordered it as a separate text, but I was also able to find a link online for the text, which I've included in the notes below. That's in the 8th section. And in the 9th section, the notes below is reference to paper 2, which I talked about at the start of the class. And you can see the copy of the paper topics in the syllabus and other documents folder. So what's left is our attendance question that would be due on the 16th and Thursday. If you need additional time, let me know. As you know, I've fallen a little bit behind with the attendance question responses, but I will be catching up the next week or two. And the attendance question is about A Midsummer Night's Dream. That after all of this, what did you find to be the most surprising thing about A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? What did you find to be the most surprising thing about A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? Again, there are no right or wrong answers. I'm just curious about your reasoning. You don't need to respond to your peers if you don't want to, but certainly you can. As if we were in a face-to-face class, you could certainly offer commentary if you so wanted to. But you are required to read your class size responses and my responses. And it might give you some ideas for a paper or ideas for something that you could use for a final exam, which will be a series of essays, some longer and some shorter, and you'll have choice within. If this was a face-to-face class, you'd have 2 hours to complete that. Since it's an online class, you'd have 24 hours to complete that. and submit it in, but we'll talk a little bit more about the finals. We get a little bit closer to the ending of the semester. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about A Raisin in the Sun. Take care. Bye-bye.